This hearing will come to order. Good morning. I want to welcome all of our witnesses and thank you for taking the time to appear and also for your thoughtful testimony. I see that Senator Lieberman is not here yet, but apparently he missed his first flight or it was canceled, but he's on his way, so we'll look forward to welcoming him back to his committee room. I'd like to first ask unanimous consent to have my written statement entered in the record, and I
reserving the right to object. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, he always does.
Actually, we're getting along better.
Normally, I ask when his back is turned to me. But I warn the witnesses too. I want to spend a little bit more time than I normally do with an opening statement because this is a really important hearing from my standpoint. I think your efforts are extremely important. I love the fact that you're starting with goals, which is, we've got 3 business people sitting at our witness table here. It's just critical, and we'll hear that in their testimony, how important it is to establish goals, because if you don't have an achievable goal, it's pretty hard to develop a strategy that's not directed toward an achievable goal. But let's start out today's committee hearing with, it's because it's a political discussion, the way I would always start out my business negotiations. I'd imagine you're probably similar to me. I didn't start my negotiations arguing. I would always spend a lot of time on the front end of any negotiation, laying out all the areas of agreement. So let's start today the way I would start those business negotiations, on a goal that we agree on. We do share the same goals, Americans. We all want a prosperous, a safe, and secure America. We actually, by the way, we issued a mission statement for this committee. It's pretty simple: to enhance the economic and national security of America. We are all concerned about each other. We all want every American to have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves or family. That's what this hearing is all about. How do you accomplish that goal? How do you accomplish that mission? And I see Senator Lieberman here. Welcome, sir.
Chairman, sorry for, I apologize for the United States error.
I just thought you were on Senate time, sir. No, No, Chairman Lieberman, it's so good to have you back here. I do have to. I'm looking. I'll introduce everybody prior to testifying. But one thing I'm noticing on your introduction, it doesn't say that you were one of the original cast members of Senate Three Amigos. So you're back here. And by the way, we have your replacement on the committee as well. So now we have Kelly Ayotte.
Agreement that my replacement was not only smarter and more able, but much better looking.
I wouldn't confirm that or dispute it. But anyway, let me pick up where I left off with that shared goal. If we concentrate on those shared purposes, the shared goals, if we don't question each other's motives, if we engage in a process that you good men and women are engaged in, trying to find the common ground to actually solve some of these problems, we're going to be a whole lot better shape. So again, I want to start with that. Now, what you're engaged in is a problem-solving process. And coming from a manufacturing background, I've solved a lot of problems. And there actually is a process you go through. In business, and this is borne out in testimony here, there's something called a strategic planning process. And in my mind, it has 4 steps to it. The first one is you have to ascertain reality. You really got to understand what the problem is. Then, based on that reality, you set achievable goals, which is what your group is trying to do here. Based on those goals, then you develop the strategies, and then the tactics are just there to support the strategies. Now, what I found in Washington, D.C. is we're always at the tactical level. So if you're just engaged in tactics, and the tactics aren't tied to a strategy, that aren't directed toward an achievable goal, that are divorced from reality, I think I just described a big part of the problem here in Washington, D.C. So again, I really commend you for your involvement in this problem-solving process, but I also want to take a step back, because I think you're kind of in the second step, and I want to spend a little bit of time on the first step, which, according to Mr. Tisch, you recognize that the first step you said in your testimony is to identify the problem. I'll add to that a little bit. You have to define it, and then I think really the first step, though, in solving any problem, once you've defined it and identified it, is you have to admit you have it. And I would argue in America, and I think this is on a bipartisan basis, we have not leveled with the American public. I don't think we collectively understand the depth of the problem. I don't think we collectively have admitted we have the problem. And until we get the public to the point of admitting the problem, we are unfortunately a long ways from solutions. Ms. Hogan, I love the fact in your testimony you talked about a SWOT analysis. Now, we were talking earlier, that's not a real common term here. When I say SWOT in Washington, D.C., people are looking for a fly or a mosquito. But in a business strategic planning process, SWOT is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Let me just go through a very fast, very abbreviated SWOT analysis on the American economy. What are our strengths? I'd mention two. We're the world's largest economy. We're the world's biggest customer. I come from the manufacturing background. Manufacturers want to be close to their customers. It makes all the sense in the world. It's an enormous competitive advantage in a global economy. We're the world's biggest customer. Also, we have abundant and relatively cheap energy. If you're going to manufacture something, you need power. And cheap power is a whole lot better than expensive power. So let's not artificially drive the cost of power up. Let's have a strong economy so we can certainly spend on keeping our environment clean, but let's keep energy cheap. Let's make sure it's abundant. Those are our strengths. What are our weaknesses? Well, take a look at our tax system. It's completely uncompetitive. If you're a global manufacturer wanting to come and take advantage of cheap energy and the world's biggest market, are you going to site your plant in Toronto with a 15% top marginal tax rate or Detroit at 35%? That's just not competitive. We have to recognize that reality, and we have to fix our tax system. What about a regulatory environment? It's onerous. We've had hearings. There are multiple studies that show that the cost of complying with federal regulations on an annual basis are approaching $2 trillion per year. Let me put that number in perspective. Only 9 economies in the world today exceed or are larger than $2 trillion. That's the burden we are placing on innovators, on people that build things, on people who are trying to grow a business and create the good-paying jobs. We've got to reduce that burden. I won't spend a whole lot of time on our legal system, which is also a disaster, and also holding our economy back. Now, those are our strengths, those are our weaknesses. What are opportunities? Well, let's fix those weaknesses. Enormous opportunities and, of course, threats. Take a look at international issues. Senator Lieberman has been just, a real leader in terms of recognizing the dangers that this nation faces. But I agree with Admiral Mike Mullen that our greatest threat to national security is our debt and deficit, which gets me to pretty much the last part of what I want to talk about here is the reality. So I've gone through this SWOT analysis. Let's take a look at the reality of the situation in terms of our debt and deficit. I've got some sheets out here. I've got some charts. We want to go through this. And I really developed this concept, the way to describe the depth of the problem of the American people with discussions in the White House. I was one of the small group of Republican senators that was working with the White House trying to find some areas of agreement on the debt and deficit. So sitting down in those talks, I started looking at how do you define the problem? We don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We have a 30-year demographic problem. All the baby boom generation were retiring at the rate of 10,000 people per day on a bipartisan basis. We've made all these promises, and we don't have a way to pay for it. Now, a lot of people talk about unfunded liabilities. The problem with that definition is it's too far in the future. It's $100 or $200 trillion, and people just can't get their heads around that. People can have some concept of what 30 years is. And unfortunately, like I always point out, my little baby girl just turned 32, and that went by like that. So this problem is going to be on us in no time. So let's just take a look at CBO's alternate fiscal scenario. Now, this is the last year's, and they're actually going to be holding a hearing today at the Budget Committee on their updated version. It's not going to vary by much. This is CBO's alternate fiscal scenario. No, keep it up. The first decade, CBO estimates about $9 trillion of deficit. Now, that's massive. That's going to take our debt up to $26, $27 trillion. I don't know when we get through the first decade without a debt crisis. But it pales in comparison to the second decade, $31 trillion of deficit. The third decade, $87 trillion for a whopping total over 30 years of $127 trillion of deficit. I put that in perspective. The entire net private asset base of America is $110 trillion. So that's the problem we're trying to deal with. Now, a way to try and adequately lay this out so it's comprehensible is a one-page income statement. Again, we get these 4-inch thick budget binders, and it just doesn't lay it out. You can really describe the federal government in one page, on a one-page income statement, and I've done it here for the 30-year deficit. You got 3 columns, outlays, revenue, deficit. The first 2 rows really point us in the direction of what needs to be fixed. And of course, you guys recognize that with your goals. Social Security over the next 30 years will pay out about $15 trillion more in benefits than it takes in the payroll tax. Medicare will pay out about $35 trillion more in benefits than it takes in the payroll tax. That's $50 trillion of the $127 trillion. The rest of that deficit is an interest. $71 trillion that's not doing anything to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. It's paying off our bondholders. So this directs our activity. We have to make Social Security and Medicare solvent. We can't run up those deficits so we don't incur the debt so we don't have to pay that interest. And of course, that's one of your goals. Now, just in case anybody's thinking that this, next chart, in case anybody is thinking this alternate fiscal scenario is overstating the case, take a look at the last 20 years in terms of average spending over as a percentage of GDP. Now, entitlement, those are estimated based on actuarial math. Defense, the last 20 years, we spent about 3.9 trillion, or 3.9% of our GDP on defense. This scenario has spending about 3.5%. Other programs, we spend about 6.7%. This scenario is only 6%. Then interest is the plug. Now, I hear, next chart, I hear all the time that, this isn't the right one. So you've got them in your packets. I hear all the time, why don't you guys just do Simpson Bowles? We've done about 81% of Simpson Bowles. We got about $700 billion of tax increases in the fiscal cliff deal. We got about $2.1 trillion of spending constraint in the Budget Control Act. So we've done about 81%, but didn't really change the trajectory. Now, if you really want to solve problems, you have to use real information. That's, again, I don't have the chart, but I've got it in your pamphlet here. We need to look at real information. We can't rely on demagoguery. You want an example of demagoguery? Paul Ryan puts forward a proposal on Medicare, premium support, whatever you want to call it. To my knowledge, it's never been scored, but there's been a political reaction to it. We had political opponents run an ad, a Paul Ryan lookalike pushing Granny off the cliff, and it was effective. Where that ad was run, the Republican didn't win. But I would argue, how does that do anything to solve our problems? Let's start using real information. So I've developed a solutions menu. I hear all the time, well, Social Security, that's the easy one to fix. Oh, yeah, you try it. I've got 2 sheets here. This is available on my website, but we have one sheet that shows by decade the score of different solutions that have been proposed. How much that $15 trillion in Social Security would something solve? Let's just pick one. Let's say we increase the age age retirement from 67 to 70. That saves about $1 trillion. Oh, by the way, over 4 years. Now, in today's political environment, that's a draconian change to Social Security. That would only save $1 trillion of the $15 trillion deficit. We have to use real information. We've got to get away from demagoguery. We're only going to solve these problems with the truth. Here's the truth that people don't want to recognize, because I hear it all the time. And this is one of the reasons the American people don't understand the depth of problems, because they're told repeatedly that Social Security is solvent to the year 2033. It's not. It's already paying more out in benefits than it's taking the payroll tax. It's already in a deficit cash flow situation, except for the fiction of the Social Security Trust Fund, that accounting convention. But let me just describe how that's just an accounting convention. You have about $2.77 trillion of U.S. government bonds in the trust fund. So it's an asset to the trust fund. The problem is a U.S. government bond's a liability to the Treasury. If you consolidate the books of the federal government, and you're looking at this is a liability to the federal government, Social Security, that transaction nets to zero, and OMB's own publication says that. I've got two quotes. One is just talking about the trust fund's just a bookkeeping convention. It's really not any asset that can really pay out those benefits. Next chart. Basically, that transaction of netting the trust fund asset against the Treasury liability, and that's to zero. But by the way, the trust fund does exist. I got a picture of it. Next chart. That's it. That's the Social Security Trust Fund. It's a 4-drawer file located in Parkersburg, West Virginia. This is what the American people are expecting. You're going to be paying off the cash flow deficit of Social Security over the next 20 or so years. That's not being honest with the American public. So the last thing I just had in this chart is a solution menu on Medicare. It's pretty sparse. We don't have many solutions to fill a $35 trillion gap. So let me close with one little story. Because unless we're willing to recognize these realities, unless we collectively are willing to take that first step in solving any problem, admitting we have one, again, I'll emphasize, we're not going to be achieving the goals that you're courageously setting out here. I was in the White House for a 2-hour meeting. President Obama joined the meeting for the last half. And of course, President Obama wanted everything on the table for discussion, tax increases, spending restraint. I mean, fair enough. And I said, Mr. President, if you're serious about wanting everything on the table, the way to get everything on the table, at least for discussion, is use your bully pulpit. Take the American people the truth. And I slid a chart similar to the one I just had up there in the 30-year deficit. Show the American people the depth of the problem so that we collectively take that first step and we have the problem. You know what he said to me? He said, Ron, we can't show the American public numbers that big. If we do, they'll get scared. They'll give up hope. And he said, besides, Ron, we can't do all the work. We have to leave some work for future presidents, future Congresses. Now, that's an almost verbatim quote. I have witnesses. Kelly was one of them. I think you all realize that without presidential leadership, we can't do big things in this country. But again, without recognizing the reality of the situation, without having elected officials being willing to tell the American people the truth, we are a long way toward being able to agree on and vote on and pass the solutions to the problems, to the goals that you've set out. So again, I just want to commend all of you for being involved in this process. Thank you for your courage. I hope you succeed. I'm certainly going to dedicate myself to doing everything I can to help you succeed. With that, Senator Carper. Thank you all for your testimony, taking the time, and just your involvement in what I think is a very worthy effort. Let me start my questioning with both Senator Lieberman and Governor Huntsman. Going back to the public really understanding the depth of the problem, understanding the reality. I certainly, it's encouraging to me to see the poll results that they are identifying, what our goals should be. And in a general sense, they understand the problem. But I've given a similar type of PowerPoint presentation in Wisconsin to audiences generally smaller than this, given to about 17,000 people. And I'll guarantee you those 17,000 people did not understand really what the 30-year deficit was, the real depth of the problem. Do you share that evaluation of it? I'll start with you, Senator Lieberman.
Yeah, I must say that I was surprised and encouraged by the fact that in this surveying done last year, that the public expressed its understanding of what the most urgent problems facing our country are, and that the ones that need to be solved. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that they're ready for everything that will have to be done to, for instance, get the federal government back in balance by 2030 or secure Social Security and Medicare for 75 years. But they get it. They get the basic problem. But you said it earlier, Mr. Chairman, ultimately this is all about leadership. It's about leadership from people in government and the private sector. We had two great leaders who have testified on this panel today to educate the public about the consequences of not dealing with our biggest national problems, such as these forests. So there's almost an intuitive way in which they get it. The American people get it. And then it's up to the people who are privileged to be in public office to both lead in taking them through a process that Congress and the White House have to go through to actually solve some of these problems.
Yeah, I think the American people have a general sense that just this is simply not sustainable. But for example, Medicare, very few people realize that right now there's $1 going into the program in terms of payroll tax, $3 being paid out in benefits. They don't realize that, the estimate's $35 trillion of deficits in Medicare alone over the next 30 years. Governor Huntsman, do you have that same evaluation in terms of people just don't understand the depth? Because let's face it, elected officials haven't exactly been forthright. I mean, all I've ever heard, not to be partisan, President Obama say about Medicare, it just needs modest reforms. I think it needs a lot more than that if we're going to save it.
You know, I'd like to make a comment that gets right to the fundamental aspects of understanding numbers and balance sheets. You understand them. You've been in business. People here at this table understand them. I would have to tell you, while serving as governor of a state, there was a real need to ratchet up the financial literacy of young people. And some had a hard time balancing a checkbook. Now, if you can't balance a checkbook, how can you understand even your very rudimentary presentation of our nation's numbers? It's an area we need to work on, and I think it goes deep into our individual states, how we approach education, how we maybe tee up financial literacy is something that we all need to recognize is an area we need to work on. So it may not connect directly with the policy aspects of what you're talking about, but it's a structural deficiency that we have. And I think the second area is the sources of information where we derive our information are not always trusted in this country. And I found that out just on the campaign trail. Everyone has their own sources of information, and you apply the trust gap or the trust deficit that exists in this country. People simply don't know what numbers to believe. Mm-hmm. And so where do you go for good, reliable numbers that actually make the arguments where people can hear everything you've said makes sense, but do I trust the numbers, and who crunched the numbers? So I think we probably need to do a better job there. Finally, I would just say that there's a natural connection between what you're talking about and the whole national strategic agenda. Well, we're out on the road, and where we're soon going to be in New Hampshire with a convention with a whole bunch of uncommitted voters. Every stop allows us an opportunity to frame, as you articulated so well, frame the argument, frame the issue, and that then takes you to steps 2 and 3, which of course we're very focused on. So we'd like to think that what we're doing is an extension of what you're calling for.
Well, again, my hope is No Labels will be the go-to group that will provide that bipartisan truth that the American people need to hear. Mr. Tisch and Ms. Hogan, I want you to comment on my down and dirty SWOT analysis of the American economy. I'll start with you, Ms. Hogan, because you were the one that brought up SWOT that allowed me to talk about that.
Sure. I mean, I think it's right on. These are maybe it's hard for the person on the street to articulate precisely what you articulated, but those are the foundational elements that if we can set some goals and make progress towards those goals, I think you'll see businesses and people alike responding in kind to those things. So yeah, I think you articulated what some of those big issues are, and also what the strengths and the opportunities are.
Mr. Tisch, did I miss anything there? Again, it was pretty abbreviated. The world's largest economy. We've got competitive energy prices, uncompetitive tax system, pretty onerous regulatory.
I think you covered the big issues, and certainly that's what we're here to talk about today. These problems are enormous, and the problems are so big that no one party can solve them. It's got to be solved by both parties together, and that's the important message that I think No Labels is trying to get across in its actions. And your analysis, I think, is very good in showing that these are huge problems. These are huge problems that America must face, and it must face it openly and really go after the solutions to them.
Ms. Hogan, I just had to go back because you talked about talking to a business person saying he needed qualified workers. He could find them, they could do the job, but state and federal requirements prevented them from being hired. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, certainly I think it speaks to immigration reform. The folks that were applying to the jobs that he offered, which were yard work and fence installation, quite simply couldn't produce the forms of ID to take the positions.
I also have a general sense, being in manufacturing myself and literally having a hard time finding people willing to work in manufacturing for the last 20 years. Now that I'm in this position, I travel all over the state, I visit manufacturing operations. To a manufacturer, their complaint is they can't find the people to work. So, we no doubt have some skills gaps, but we also have a worker gap, and I think there are multiple reasons for that as well. I think we need to address that. I guess Senator Ayotte. Here's one thing that works. How about we incentivize and celebrate success rather than demonize and demagogue against it? I mean, as you're growing your business, do you find it dispiriting people say you're not paying your fair share, or you don't care about your worker safety, or in business myself, I actually was trying to build a business, create good paying jobs, and I think if more elected officials celebrated those types of successes, I think we'd be doing better.
It works every time, if we can get positive incentives, it works much better than penalties every day.
One business concept that we were kind of hinting at, but we haven't really named it, it's called benchmarking. I mean, if we're going to compete in the global economy, and by the way, we have to compete. It's not a choice. I mean, we have to compete. We have to benchmark, right? So again, isn't that what we do in a SWOT analysis in a business? You'd lay out your weaknesses, and you have to benchmark those weaknesses against your competitors. Again, that's a tax system. That's a regulatory environment. The ranking member was talking about spending 18% of our economy on healthcare. Well, that's back in 2009. That was about $2.5 trillion worth. So there's a lot of concern about we got to get those costs under control. But I mentioned in my opening statement, we spend about $2 trillion complying with federal regulations. Where's the effort to contain and control that expenditure? Listen, we all need regulations. We need that rules of the road. We want a clean environment. We want worker safety. We want product safety. But there's a concept called the law of diminishing returns. And I guess I would argue we probably passed the law of diminishing returns. We certainly don't have certainty in the legal environment, and we have so many laws, so many regulations. And those laws and regulations are enforced at the discretion of either prosecutors or district attorneys or regulators. Do you find you have a lot of certainty in business, Ms. Hogan?
I have certainty if I hire a legal team on just about every issue.
That's pretty efficient for...
It's not efficient at all. Yeah, I mean, I would like to spend a much larger percentage of my time with my customers and promoting the goods and services that we offer than the time that I spend with our attorney.
Mr. Tisch, I certainly talk to business people that legitimately complain about how much time they're spending, mental time, physical time, trying to comply with regulations, trying to make sure they're not getting in trouble, as opposed to literally trying to innovate and create and build. Do you find that in your business?
Every one of our businesses has legal issues, regulations that we have to deal with on a national level, on a state level, on a local level. Yes, it makes life much more difficult for us. Somehow we manage to work through it, but if they were reduced dramatically, we would be much more productive. But we look at it as a cost of doing business that
a very high cost of business, and again, that's costing economic growth, which means that's costing those good long-term self-sustaining jobs in the private sector.
It's a very high cost. Some of it makes sense.
Well, sure.
I'm not going to say it's all wasted money and it's all wasted effort. There are some that make sense, but there are times when we make decisions as to where to do something based on the amount of regulation that's involved in doing something in a particular venue versus another venue.
No, there's a lot of regulations that make sense to a point. Again, right. Environmental, worker safety, product safety, right. Those make sense, but
those are all the first things
you can go beyond a point of no return.
We consider those first thing before we consider anything else. But after that, we make decisions based on where it makes most sense for us to do to conduct the business.
Governor Huntsman, you mentioned financial literacy. Senator Ayotte was talking about that too. Here's the good news. We don't have to wait for necessarily the federal government to act. One of the reasons I actually decided I could afford to leave my business and run for the U.S. Senate is I was volunteering a lot of time in education in Oshkosh. Our first initiative was in Oshkosh. We actually had financial literacy requirement added to our graduation requirements before the State Department of Public Instruction did. I mean, so you can get involved in your local school system and prompt the school board to actually instill those standards. So that's actually good news, and it's actually critical. I also wanted to mention, I was at a luncheon, No Labels event with you. I was on a panel. Don't know if you remember that.
Of course.
But one of the panelists said it starts with compromise. And that's extremely important, no doubt about it. But I made the point, what's the last step in the process? getting back to then laying out starts with reality, setting an achievable goal, then start developing strategies. And once you start laying out the different strategies, that's where you have to start compromising.
That's right. So
the way I like talking about this, and this is what I'm hoping No Labels can bring to the table, is it starts with agreement. It starts with agreeing on the figures. For example, in business, if you sit down and negotiate, let's say you're buying a business. If the seller's got one set of audited books, or just set of books, and the buyer's got another set, and they're completely different, you'll never reach a successful negotiation. You actually have to have that audited set of books that everybody agrees on. So that, to me, that's an extremely important part. Let's push the areas of agreement. And that's really what Senator Carper and I have done with the committee. Starting out with that area of agreement, our mission statement to enhance the economic and national security of America, laying out some initial priorities, whether it's border security, cybersecurity, regulatory reform. We're going to hopefully report out another at least dozen bills on a unanimous basis out of the committee. They're maybe not grand slams, maybe they're bunt singles, but they're incremental improvement. They're fixing something. And I think if we really concentrate on those areas of agreement, I think that's the better way of approach in terms of saying we got to compromise right away. Compromise will come, but there's a number of steps right before that. Senator Lieberman, again, you've been involved in this process. Can you just kind of comment on that?
Well, I think you're right on in what you've just said. Senator Ayotte referred to it about compromise, but compromise is not where it begins. The problem-solving process begins with identification of the problem, agreement on goals, which are quite general usually, and then you get into the strategy, some of the negotiating of what you really want to do. To get that done, you need compromise. So the successful problem-solving process doesn't begin with compromise, but it won't end successfully unless people around the table are willing to compromise. And as Kelly said, Senator Ayotte, there's nothing more wrong about compromise. And we're not talking about compromising your principles. It's a question of accepting less than 100%. If you can get 50 or 60 or 70%, my dad used to say a successful marriage is one in which both spouses think that their ideas are prevailing 80% of the time. And the legislating is sometimes like that. Ted Kennedy, who was the sort of leading liberal of his time, did a series of remarkable agreements with Republicans who were on his committee, mostly really conservative Republicans, and he had what he variously called the 60, 70, or 80% rule, depending on. And the rule was, if we can agree on 60% of this bill before us, big bill, whatever it was, education, health, let's just set aside the 40% and let's do the 60%. That's simplistic, but it led to a lot of significant bipartisan achievement.
It's completely accurate. Again, in my method of negotiating, when you lay out all the areas of agreement, if you spend a lot of time figuring out all the areas of agreement, you develop a relationship, you develop a level of a trust, so when you finally come to those areas of disagreement, it's just a whole lot easier finding common ground. And what you may find is, let's not even deal with those. Let's just concentrate on the areas of agreement and move forward. And again, that's why I'm so encouraged about what you're trying to do here, is you're trying to set up that process of agreement. Senator Carper. I think you accurately described the House. And of course, there's obviously some red states and blue states that we have certainly divisions here in the Senate, but then there's quite a few purple states. I represent one. And so there's less of that dynamic here in the Senate, which is why I think we can look to the Senate to hopefully lead on this issue. So again, I want to thank all of you for being involved, for your time you've taken, for your thoughtful testimony. I think the fact that we held this hearing should indicate to you, certainly my commitment, I think this committee's commitment to do everything we can to help you succeed. I think it's just critical. We have to solve these problems. In our organizing meeting, after we set that mission statement, after we agreed on those priorities, I set an aspirational goal for our committee. And I said, listen, I don't question anybody's motives. I do believe that every member that ran, certainly in the Senate and the House, ran to accomplish something, to do right by their constituents, to solve these problems. And the fact of the matter is, the United States Senate, in order to solve problems, you have to pass legislation. Currently, that requires, we got 54 Republicans, we need at least 6 Democrats to join us to pass things. And so we have 7 Democrats on this committee. So the aspirational goal is let's concentrate on the areas of agreement. Let's not worry about things that divide us. Let's worry about the things that we agree on. And that's certainly what you're trying to do, and we want to be fully supportive. Let me end kind of where I started, reality, because that's where it has to start. We have to lay out the reality of the situation. We have to tell the American people the truth. We have to have the courage to tell people the truth. You know, from my standpoint, the reason nobody, even though I've been talking about a 30-year deficit, this massive deficit for a couple of years, the reason it isn't picked up on is because if you acknowledge that as an elected official, if you acknowledge the depth of the problem, you have to do something about it. And doing something about it's not going to be particularly fun. It's going to require bipartisanship. It's going to require people getting together and coming forward in front of the American people and leading. But we first have to lead by telling the truth and laying out the realities. You know, a couple comments on some things said. You know, Senator Carper was talking about the Commission on Social Security, recognizing if we didn't do something, benefits were going to be cut. That's the current law. If we don't do anything, when this bookkeeping convention runs out on the trust fund, benefits will be reduced to the level of receipts. So it's just, you can't take it off the table. You have to address it, or we're going to be hitting something that the American people are not going to like, and they shouldn't. Talked about curing diseases. You know, one reality that I don't think is cooked into anybody's figures, I don't think it's cooked into the alternate fiscal scenarios, what is the cost of Alzheimer's? I'm a fiscal conservative. I'm highly supportive of the federal government spending money on basic science and research, spending money to cure diseases. We need to take a look at the grant writing process so those funds are allocated as best as possible. So again, we have to start with reality. I am looking to your group. I'm begging your group. As much as I appreciate those goals, please work with me, work with this committee to lay out the reality and have the courage. Give us the courage as elected officials to use what little bully pulpits we have to tell the American people the truth. And let me finish with this last story, because it'll tell you what my commitment is. Before I took over the chairmanship, after the election, I knew I'd be chairman. We started interviewing people for staff positions. And I've been very fortunate, by the way, to be able to get some great staff, a lot of them from Senator Tom Coburn, who I think we both, he's a hero, certainly to me. I think certainly Senator Carper respects him. We interviewed one individual, one female staff member, and she said, Senator Johnson, what would success look like a year into your chairmanship? A darn good question. It's the kind of question I would ask somebody in an interview. Hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but I had an immediate answer. I said, if every presidential candidate, both Republican and Democrat, were forced, and I have to, it's kind of sad, I have to say forced, to address the issues we're going to raise in this committee, that would be success. We cannot afford to have an election in 2016 run on political platitudes and demagoguery. We have got to have an effort like you're putting forward here with no labels, where we go to the American people, we tell them the truth. That's what I'm dedicated to doing. And again, I appreciate your efforts. I appreciate your working with me on this. With that, the hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 2nd at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.